Liza here with episode 41. I'm at the right place at the right time with the right person. Welcome to Wonders and Miracles podcast, where we celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. I'm your host, Liza Lawrence, a wife, mother, teacher, and miracle lover. If you're new to this podcast, this is what we do here. Each week on Miracle Monday, we celebrate awe-inspiring true stories from regular people like you and me. People who have experienced something surprising and wonderful that could be considered the work of a divine source. My desire is to help us recognize God's hand and His love in our lives, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen. Thanks for listening to the show. Now let's celebrate wonders and miracles together. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1, 2, 4, and 11. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. He hath made everything beautiful in His time. Today, Cindy takes us on a beautiful journey of loss and love. She shares how she's had reassurances from the Lord along the way that she was in the right place at the right time with the right person throughout her life. After losing 2 husbands, it was her attitude of gratitude that helped her and the trust that she had in the Lord's timing of her life. I'm excited for you to hear Cindy's story, but first I want to give a shout out to the review of the week. This is from J. Elliott. I love listening to this podcast and hearing these miracles from ordinary, everyday people. It really is true that the more we look for miracles, the more we will see. I started listening just a few weeks ago, and my kids listen in. My 5-year-old came home from school a few days after listening and was so excited to tell me about a miracle that happened on the playground. She was on the monkey bars and lost hold with one hand. She said the miracle was that she was able to grab hold again and not fall. I thought that was super cute. I've seen more in my life as well. Thank you. I love that review, and I love that this 5-year-old is noticing. What a beautiful thing to teach our children, that there are miracles everywhere, and they'll start noticing. And I love that her little girl found that miracle in being able to grab hold of that monkey bar again. Isn't life beautiful, and isn't God amazing? If you're enjoying the podcast and you have not left a review yet on iTunes, please go do that. It does help people find this podcast, and I think the more people that find it, the more light we can bring to the world. All right, let's jump into Cindy's story. So I'm here with Cindy today, and she is a woman that I just have admired over the years, and I love her story and her strength that she's shown through her journey. And I'm excited that she's here to share her story with us. So Cindy, thanks for being on the show, and start wherever you feel you need to start.
Well, thank you so much, Liza, for having me. Over the course of my life, I think I have learned to maybe look back and look at situations. I think that when you hear of miracles and wonders, and a lot of times people will pinpoint that to a specific event. A few years ago, started looking back at my life, and from the very beginning, there was a lot of events that either myself or others were at the right place at the right time. I don't believe it's by chance. I don't believe that there is anything less than some divine intervention. My story starts actually back, it was June 13th, 1966. There was a nurse that had gone in to fulfill her shift at a small hospital in Burley, Idaho. As she was there, a lady came in and she said, I don't know how far along I am. I have had no prenatal care. I am delivering today, and I am not leaving with this baby. The woman had admitted that she had drank a lot, that she'd smoked a lot, and that she didn't know what the situation was going to be. So the doctor He checked her and he figured that she was probably somewhere around 8 months along, wasn't exactly sure. She wasn't showing much, and he really wasn't sure what the situation with the baby was going to be, but he did know that this woman was adamant that she was delivering the baby and that she was not going to take the baby with her. The baby would be staying at the hospital. So the nurse that was there to assist prepped the woman and got everything ready, and the doctor induced her, and there was a baby born that was not quite 5 pounds, and that baby happened to be me.
Wow.
The woman was my birth mother. The doctor said to the nurse, he said, I think I can pull some strings if you and your husband are interested in this baby. A few days later, they were able to take me home, and the nurse became my mother. The interesting backstory of that is that my adoptive mother was not supposed to be at the hospital that day. She was actually filling in for somebody. I hadn't really thought much about that until later in life, and I thought the odds of that are pretty slim. And then as I was growing up, I was not an easy kid. I started out, my mom said that I was withdrawing from whether it was nicotine or whether it was alcohol or whatever, but she said I cried a lot. I was not an easy baby. And yet I could not have had better parents. I mean, my parents just loved me through it, loved me through a lot of insecurities as I was a little girl and a teenager. Flash forward, I found myself in a situation when it would have been my second year of college, and I was involved in a date rape situation, and I ended up getting pregnant.
Oh, wow.
And I went to my parents, and my mom said, you know what, we will support you in whatever you do. And I remember the exact moment that I heard a voice, and it said, you can be my mom, you will be fine, we've got this. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had been told by this little voice that everything would be okay and that we've got this.
Wow.
So I ended up having my daughter, and my life changed substantially. I've always said that she was this angel that was sent to help get me through, and she's an amazing, amazing girl. The thing that I think I've always found miraculous about that was that she was my one and only child that I could conceive and have, that I personally was able to. And so it was really interesting how that all worked out. My adoptive mother, she got cancer when my little girl was 18 months. And I remember thinking, there is no way that I can do this without my mom. And once again, I had an experience where I did not know if I was going to be able to make it through, because my mom was my best friend. She was my cheerleader. I had this baby. I was a single mom. And she knew everything was going to be okay, but I just, for some reason, couldn't believe it. She lived till Brittany was 5. And one night, it was the night before she passed away, I was sitting there talking to my mother, and I just cried, and I said, you can't go. I can't lose you. And she was trying to reassure me. And all of a sudden, this little 5-year-old just jumped up on my mom's lap, and she touched her cheek, and she said, my mom will be just fine, because she just doesn't remember. But when you're in heaven, you can look after the people that you love. She goes, we'll be fine. And once again, I knew that this little spirit that has spoke to me that said that we've got this, we'll be fine, prior to her being born, was reminding me once again that I could do this. So a year later, I met my first husband, Craig, and he was everything my mom would have wanted for me and nothing like I was dating. And it made no sense. I was a single mom. I was 26. I'd never been married. He was 8 years older than me, had gone through a horrible divorce, had a really mean ex-wife that scared me, and 3 kids. None of it made sense. But I remember distinctly knowing that I was at the right place at the right time with the right person, and that everything was going to be okay. And it was absolutely amazing. I mean, we worked hard. We were flat, busted, broke. I don't know how we did it sometimes, but there was not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that I was with who I was supposed to be with. And he was just an amazing father to my daughter. And I think Brittany was probably about 19 or 20 at the time. I remember thinking, I just have such a good life. We'd finally gotten at a point where it was easier financially and spiritually. Just everything was just flowing together. And my daughter, Brittany, remembers having that same thought about that same time. And she says, I have got the best family. Well, on June 26th, 2000 10, I got a phone call. Earlier in that day, I am a realtor, and so we had sponsored a golf tournament, and we'd been at the golf tournament, and for some reason, I was just antsy to get a hold of Craig. And he had been on a whitewater rafting trip. He was a youth leader for the young men in our church, and they were in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and they were doing some whitewater rafting. And I had talked to him the day before, and he said, "Don't worry if you can't get a hold of me tomorrow because we'll be on the river." But for some reason, I just kept trying to get a hold of him. And in the meantime, my brother calls and says that they're rushing my nephew to primary children's because they thought he had leukemia. And so I immediately thought, well, no, I have to get a hold of him because I have to tell him I'm leaving. And it was just this urgency to talk to him. And all of a sudden, as we're cleaning up, the sky just went black. And the wind started blowing, and it was like nothing I had ever experienced. I mean, a lot of times in Idaho, we'll have quick little storms that pass through, but this was different. And my daughter remembers distinctly driving back from Idaho Falls, and she remembers the storm as well. And it was so bad that she had to pull off underneath an overpass and wait for the rain to subside. I never remember seeing the sky so dark or seeing such crazy wind, and then it just stopped, and it was really calm. Within an hour, I would say, I got a phone call. They had said that I needed to come to Jackson, that there had been an accident. And I remember in my mind thinking, oh, well, I guess he's wrecked the pickup. In my mind, that's what I was thinking. But as my daughter asked me, she says, "What's going on?" I says, "We need to go to Jackson." She says, "What's happened?" I says, "There's been an accident, and I don't think your dad's going to make it." And as I said the words, she looked at me and I looked at her, and she said, "I saw this. He drowned." And I said, "What?" We got in the car. My daughter's friend was there. She started to drive us to Jackson. We got the phone call that indeed my husband had passed away and that he had drowned. It had been their third time down the river that day. He was experienced on the river. He had been a guide. He had done a lot of whitewater rafting. I remember I'd had a few concerns prior to him leaving, and I had asked him, I said, "Are you sure about this?" And he says, "Cindy, you have to trust me. Nothing will happen to these boys. Everyone's going to be fine, but they need this experience." And he kept reassuring me of that. Wow. And so I trusted him. So as we drove to Jackson, I remember looking around and just touching things, touching the door of my car, just trying to grasp a hold of what was happening and to realize that my life as I knew it was never going to be the same. It didn't take me long to realize that this hadn't happened necessarily by chance, that this was part of a plan that I didn't understand. It was bigger than me. And I actually knew that, I have to say, very early on, because I was inspired that I needed to speak at his funeral, and I needed to let the boys that were on that trip know that I didn't know why they were chosen to be there at that particular spot and why those that were there were and why those that weren't, but I knew there was a reason. My daughter and I, as we looked back, really felt like there were things when you look back on situations that you can identify as tender mercies, or you can identify as whether you want to call miracles or blessings. But both of us had an experience. The day that he left, I was leaving to go to visit some friends. Brittany and I were leaving, and he walked around and kissed me goodbye. And then he walked around and gave Brittany a hug and kiss goodbye. And she said, it just felt different. And he came back around and just stopped and looked at me, and he said, "I love you in white." And I had a white jacket and white shorts on. He says, "I love you in white." He says, "You look like an angel in white." And he just kissed me and said goodbye. And that was the last time that I saw him alive. So the year or so after, I mean, it was difficult, but I couldn't deny the fact that I knew that this was part of a plan, and that everything was going to be okay. And about a year after he passed away, there was a friend that insisted that I meet his friend, and he would not take no for an answer. And it was to the point where I finally just said, fine, whatever. But I said, I'm really not ready to date anyone. He said, well, it's kind of interesting. He says, he only lives through the block from you. And I said, yeah, I have no idea who he is. I didn't really want to know who he was. Finally, I gave in and I said, okay, we can go to dinner. So the four of us went to dinner. As I was getting ready for my date, I remember thinking, it's probably not really respectful to go on a date with a wedding ring on. And I stood at my jewelry box, and as I took it off, I cried because I knew I'd never put it back on. And so that night after we went out, we were talking, and he says, I remember the first time I met you. And I said, you do? He says, it was the day that your husband was killed. He says, I was on the golf course. He said, I remember my friend Neil introduced me to you. He was still married at the time. He says, I remember that night hearing that your husband had been killed. And he says, and all of a sudden I remembered meeting you. So it was one of those situations where we met, we fell in love, and we got married. It went quite fast, faster than I was at all comfortable with. And interestingly enough, I remember one night, I mean, whether you meditate or whether you pray or whatever, there's those times where you just are pouring your heart and guts out. And I was pouring my heart and guts out to my Heavenly Father. And I just said, this is not what I want. So maybe you ought to just fix this and make this not happen. And I remember distinctly having the impression you're at the right place at the right time with the right person. Just like I had felt with my first husband when nothing made sense. And I thought, well, shoot, I guess this is the way it's going to be then. So we got married and we were so happy. And what I loved the most, I think, is that he loved my late husband. In our religion, there's an ordinance called sealing, and you're sealed to your spouse. And my second husband, Rick, had been really worried about that. And I didn't realize how much that bothered him. And he came to me one day and he said, I have been really struggling with the idea of marrying Craig's wife and how he really feels about that. But he didn't know Craig in this life. He says, I just love and respect him so much, and I don't want to do anything that would be disrespectful to him. And I don't know how you're going to take this, but he said, Craig came to me. And I said, really? I wish he'd come to me.
And at this time, were you married?
No, it was right as we were going to be getting married. And he said that he approached him. He said that he was in work clothes. He says he wasn't clothed in white with the big, he says he looked busy. He said, Rick, he says, you're my brother. And Craig had this just bigger than life personality and smile. And he just said, you're my brother and I love you. And he says, thank you for loving Cindy and Brittany. And Rick said, but what about, he said, I felt myself want to ask him. And he just smiled and he says, it's different here. It's just so different here, Rick. And then he said that he was busy. He had to go, and reminded him again that he loved him. So I thought, well, okay. I knew that Craig knew what he was talking about. I trusted him, and Rick did too. And so anyway, we got married, and one day we were in LDS temple, and you wear all white in there. And I was sitting there, and Rick walked in, he stopped, and he looked at me, and he said, I love you in white. You look like an angel in white.
Oh.
And I knew that I had Craig's blessing.
Yeah.
I knew that it was bigger than anything I understood, but I knew that I was at the right place at the right time with the right person. And Rick and I packed so much into such a little amount of time. His divorce, there was some hurt feelings, and it was really interesting how together collectively we were able to bring his kids back around, and it just felt good. And I think that they healed some situations with their mother, and it was good. Life was really, really good. And we bought a Harley Davidson. We went on motorcycle trips. We had so much fun. In fact, I remember one day he came back from riding, and I says, where have you been? He says, well, I went out to the cemetery to show Craig my new bike. And it did my heart good. I mean, he loved Craig. He didn't know him in this life, but he loved him, and he loved Craig's sisters, and he loved Craig's parents, and they loved him. So things were good. And my daughter Brittany met her now husband, and they were dating, and and it was bittersweet because she would love to have her dad there, but Rick was there, and he got her married, and things were so good. That was in May, and in August we were actually in Island Park with my first husband Craig's family, and Rick had been acting kind of off. And my brother-in-law brought him back from fishing, and he said, something's wrong with Rick. Well, I called my stepson, Tyrell, who's a physician's assistant, and he said, you need to get my dad to the hospital. This doesn't sound good. So we got to the hospital, and he went through all the questions, and I think he thought that he was having a stroke. They did a CAT scan and an MRI, and as I saw the film loading up, I looked over, and I could see a mass that stood out to me on his brain. And I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't good. And they told us that Rick had a brain tumor. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, I promised him that God wouldn't do this to me again, and that we were going to have this long life, and we had all these plans. And I thought, how in the world is this happening?
And how long had you been married at this point?
We had been married a year and a half. And I remember distinctly, once again, I was there in the emergency room and I felt or heard, however you want to explain it, you're at the right place at the right time with the right person. And I'm thinking, how is that so? Because I knew enough to know that more than likely this wasn't good. So it kind of went fast and furious. He had surgery to remove the tumor. We were at the Huntsman having radiation and chemo. We spent 6 months in Salt Lake, which ended up being the 6 months that he lived. The doctors had told us that with the type of tumor that he had 6 months, maybe a year and a half to live. But the glioblastomas, they do not survive those. But I knew so many times during that journey that I was at the right place at the right time with the right person. And I watched relationships heal. I was really blessed with the situation where we were able to stay there. I was able to be there with him. And I know that he died knowing that he was loved and that he was happy and his family was happy. And it was such a blessing. And Rick had told me that several times that Craig was there with him when he went in for a surgery. And there was a couple of times in radiation where it was really, really intense. And he said that Craig had been there with him. And I felt that. I knew that. So at the time that he passed away, I remember once again thinking, I know this is part of a bigger plan, but I don't get it. And I started to kind of waver in do I just want to believe so badly that I'm doing these right things, or is this truly part of a plan? I was really struggling with just the loss of both my husbands, my daughter getting married. And in the meantime, I had invested my life insurance with someone that I trusted and lost every dime of it. So I'm thinking, wow. I'm broke, I'm alone. And I thought, if I really am at the right place at the right time, please let something, I felt like I was doing the right thing. Why is everything just falling apart? And about that time, out of the blue, I got a call from an old friend. He had been one of those friends that we all grew up together. He started drinking, he started doing drugs, and every once in a while he would reach out to me through social media, and usually I could not make heads or tails what he was saying because he was out of his mind. But he was just one of those people that you knew had a good heart. And about a year again after, I got a phone call. There was a man crying on the phone. I said, "Who is this?" And he told me who he was, and he said, "I have been in jail. I've got to get my life together, and I don't know who to call. I don't know what to do." I hadn't heard from this man in almost 30 years. We'd been friends growing up. I think he'd burned all his bridges. So I had this feeling that I needed to figure out a way to help him. So I started making some phone calls, and I have a friend that's a drug and alcohol psychologist. And I called her, and she says, "You need to get him to 90 meetings in 90 days. And thinking, I can't do that. He lived in 2.5 hours away. Then I called another friend, and she says, "Well, there is a substance abuse class that is tonight." So I called him back and I said, "Okay, I'm coming and we're going to this meeting." So I started going every Friday night. That Friday night, there was a gentleman there that had been clean and sober for many years, but was very supportive of the addiction recovery program. And he took this friend of mine under his wing. That led me to my now third husband. And it was actually a cousin of my friend who called me. Mike, my husband now, and I had dated 30 years ago. He went his way, I went mine. And in the process of me going to the classes with his cousin, we got talking, and Mike, he had gone through a horrible divorce. I remember thinking, oh, poor guy, no one should touch him with a 10-foot pole. I mean, I could be his friend and I could talk him through things, but I thought, this is a mess. And I remember one day distinctly, about probably a year and a half after I would talk to him every once in a while, just make sure he was doing okay, things started to change a little bit. And I knew, and I had that same thought, feeling, voice, whatever, that said, you're at the right place at the right time with the right person. And we've now been married. It'll be 4 years on New Year's Day. And I think that for me, I believe that not every wonder and miracle has this happy ending. For Craig to be taken the way he was and when he was, and when we finally had gotten our feet underneath us and life seemed so good, seemed really, really unfair. But there was a lot of miracles in that. And the miracles were that every other man on that trip had young wives, young families with many little kids. That day, there were 6 boys in that boat and 4 leaders. None of those boys were harmed. They also were able to get his body back into the boat so that we did not lose his body. Craig was a big man and these were not big boys. So I look at those miracles, and then the miracle of me finding love a second time and finding Rick and gaining a whole other family of amazing humans that love me and I love them, and watching how they have loved and accepted Craig and Craig's family. And it's just grown our family even bigger. And now a chance a third time. And in Rick's situation, glioblastomas and brain tumors can be so awful. And yes, his wasn't great, but he did not suffer to the point that he didn't recognize us. And so to me, that's such a miracle in itself. Mm-hmm. And then the situation where I'm at now, and it's been really interesting because with the blessings have come challenges. It hasn't been easy, but I know that I'm at the right place at the right time with the right person. And I know that I have been put in those situations more than once. And I'm so grateful that I've been able to acknowledge that and recognize it as such. I think a lot of times people think of miracles out of someone's life being spared. And in my case, I look at the timing of things as well. I mean, if Craig wouldn't have died when he did, I wouldn't have been available for Rick when he was going through, and now Mike. And I think that I have to acknowledge that those are definitely miracles. Although I think traditionally when we think of miracles, we think of someone being healed or someone being saved. And I do believe that we all have a choice sometimes how we view these things, and we will miss these miracles and these wonders if we don't adjust our view just a little bit.
Yeah, I love that it really is in our perspective of how we see our journey and how we see the lessons that we're learning and the opportunities for growth. And that's what impresses me about you, that you've been able to, and I'm sure, like you acknowledged, the challenges and the hard times, but to also notice and be grateful for being in the right place at the right time with the right person. I do love your perspective and that attitude of learning through the journey.
I do believe that I made a conscious choice. It wasn't me necessarily having the strength to do it, but I knew that I could either be in a heap on the floor and stay there, or I could keep going. And for some reason, it reminded me of when my daughter went to kindergarten, because Brittany was so excited to go to kindergarten. She goes skipping on the bus and is waving, and I didn't think twice about it. Well, the little friend with her at the bus stop was in a heap. I mean, her mother was just wondering if this was the right thing to do, although her mother knew that kindergarten was a good thing. It wasn't going to hurt her. She was going to be fine. But I remember her mother sharing with me later that she worried about her. She called me several times saying, maybe she isn't ready for this. She can't handle this. I said, she'll be fine. I said, she'll be fine. And even though the mother knew that, she really struggled with that. As opposed to me, Brittany was probably scared to death, but she bound up the stairs and got on the bus. And I thought, okay, I could be in a heap and make Craig, worry and hold back from doing the things that he needed to do, as opposed to him going, she'll be fine. She's got this. Craig knew me well enough to know that I was not necessarily completely okay, but yet I was going to figure out a way, and that could put his spirit and him in a place where he needed to be, because I'm a firm believer that what Craig told Rick, it's different there. Yeah. And I believe that there is work to be done, and I believe that they're very involved in our lives, but I also believe that sometimes if we are stuck in a place, it really does hinder them from doing the work that they need to do. So I kind of felt a responsibility and an obligation to him to not make him feel like he had to linger and tarry to care for me in a heap on the floor. And I wanted to be in that heap. Often I wanted to be in that heap. But you know what? I knew that was not going to serve myself. And if I couldn't think of me, I had to think of those around me and Craig on the other side.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that perspective. I don't know that I would have ever thought of that in that way, that by you handling the situation with strength and courage would free him up to go do the work he needed to do on the other side. I think that's an amazing perspective, honestly.
It's interesting. That's one thing that I have to acknowledge. If I'm going to acknowledge that there's been any miracles, which I do definitely see, I've lost a lot of people right after Rick, my second husband, then my father passed away. And so anybody that was stability to me is gone. They're gone from this life, but holy cow, I've got a whole army on the other. And I think they still expect a lot from me. I can't just say, well, they're not here to hold me accountable. I feel a real responsibility to work hard and not let them down and get stuck in a spot where I am ungrateful, and to get stuck in a spot where I feel where I can't acknowledge that there have been beautiful miracles in the midst of, some really hard trials and a lot of loss and a lot of grief, would be really ungrateful of me. And I remember growing up, and it was just known in our family that you have to have an attitude of gratitude. And I feel like that if I'm not grateful for my trials, then I'm missing out. And so I felt like that I had to find some good in the trials, or I was ungrateful, and I don't want to be ungrateful. I guess I was raised to think that lack of gratitude was kind of not a really desirable thing. So I don't want to let any of my, I don't want to let my mom down, and my grandmother and all those people that tried so hard to make me into some sort of refined young lady, which I don't know, it worked real well, but they tried really hard.
I think it's worked. And I can see that attitude of gratitude has pulled you through and gotten you through this. I think that's probably the thing that has pulled you through and kept you going and kept you optimistic too. Well, thank you. Beautiful story.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liza. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
There's our episode. Cindy's an amazing woman, and I love her view on life and how her attitude of gratitude just has carried her through so much, and how the Lord led her to the right person at the right time in her life. I think that's beautiful. Quick reminder to share the podcast. If you could send it to one person this week, that would be amazing. Post it on your social media. Follow me on Instagram or Facebook. Also, if you have a miracle story that you'd like to share, please submit that on my website at wondersandmiracles.com. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1, 2, 4, and 11. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. This episode was brought to you by the attitude of gratitude. I hope that you can think of a time in your life that you were in the right place at the right time with the right person, and that you were grateful for that. And as always, remember to notice and celebrate the miracles everywhere, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen.